While playing the Gundam Card Game Beta, I've noticed that with the limited card pool we have, there's like really one true way that lets you consistently get to the end game and like have a chance at winning games, which I've basically summed up with the phrase, the late game exists, make sure you get there with gas, and board control is also kind of important. To understand what I mean by gas, I need you to imagine that both you and your opponent is cars in a race. Your hand is the fuel, and the deck is where you can refuel. You need to use your fuel to move through the game and ensure you both don't fall behind your opponent, but don't use too much to try and pull too far ahead. If you use all of your fuel in the early and mid game and you don't win this race of the game, you basically crash into a wall and have to wait for your card to refuel, and as your opponent can then just use the resources they have into their hand to just pull ahead and win the game off the back of that. This doesn't necessarily mean to not use your resources in the early game, because if you don't use them, your opponent can pull so far ahead that it's basically impossible for you to put anything down in time that can stop them from winning the game. This video is going to talk you through how to effectively reach the end game state through your early and mid game strategies, and how to play through some bricky/bad hands. Currently, the opening turns are some of the least impactful part of the game, but that does not mean that they're still not important in knowing how to play, especially if you don't have the best hand. Opening turns are roughly like 1 to 3 turns, and the main goal is to, if you have a bad hand, you want to try and stabilize and prepare yourself for your plan for the mid game, or if you have a hand you can start playing with immediately, it's to try and gain a small advantage. So once you enter the middle stages of the game, you are ready to try and push that advantage a little bit further. Unless you have a strong draw engine in your hand with overflowing affection or show of resolve, it's usually best to try and play slow and maintain a small advantage. You don't want to push things too hard. You'll only want to be playing out roughly like 1 unit per turn to ensure you keep your hand resources up to handle whatever your opponent puts out. If you have multiple 1-cost units in hand, it can be beneficial to play like multiple in one turn to establish some extra board presence. However, I would only recommend doing this on 1 turn, as if you try to do it multiple times, you can end up whittling down your hand too much for the mid game. An exception to the 1 unit per turn rule is if your opponent starts playing out multiple units. In this scenario, you'll want to play it in a very reactive manner to put out the minimum resources required to handle their board. If you're able to keep a level or advantageous board state while using less resources than your opponent, you'll be in a very strong position as you enter the mid game. Unlike the opening turns, the mid game is the most crucial part of the game, where the games are both won and lost. The main focus here is going to be your resource management, taking the upper hand, and I personally break it down into 4 different types. These are cards in hand, your units and pilots, your resource cards, and your shields. The section for the mid game is going to be broken down into 2, where the first section will cover more in depth and give more context to how I think about these resources, and the second will cover how to use your resources through the game and give an example turn. While these resources might look very self-explanatory on what they mean, I want to go a little more in depth for what you need to look out for and how to consider them. Cards in hand is one of the easiest to explain, as it's always going to be a number between 1 and 10, and will represent how much you and your opponent can potentially do. While not all cards in your hand will be useful at every moment, keeping an advantage in hand size will mean there's a higher chance that you'll be able to take the initiative on a play and gain the upper hand. Units and pilots is also easy to understand, as it is simply what units they have on the field, and if any of those units are paired with a pilot. In the most simple form, if you have more units on the field, you have the board advantage, as you'll be able to do more swings to the shield area. In most cases though, it won't be that simple, such as if they have blockers on board, that will extend further as they will have ways to deal with your advantage and your swings. Moving on to resource cards, this is the easiest and the quickest to explain, as they simply represent how much you and your opponent can do in 1 turn. Finally, moving on to the shields. It can be easy to think of these as just your health, but I think it's best to think of these as a resource, as it lets you better assess the threats on board. It's not always a bad thing for your opponents to be taking out your shields, as when they swing, their suspended units will be vulnerable to being swung into with your units, meaning you could establish board presence and handle what cards they have put out. The best way to handle your shield area though is by using your base cards. If you have an open shield area, a base will return the next shield to be taken to hand instead of it being sent to the trash by an attack, basically acting as an extra draw. This leaves you with the same amount of cards in your shield area, but a new card in your hand. Now for the important part, which is how to look at your available resources in the context of the game. Consider the following game state. Both you and your opponent have 5 resources on the field, but you have an EX resource. All of your opponent's resources are rested. You both have 4 cards in hand. Your hand comprises of a base and 3 units. Your opponent has 4 units with 3 of them being rested. You also have 4 units, but as it is the start of your turn, all your units are unrested. You both have 4 shields left with no bases. This is a very even board state, but with it being your turn, you have the initiative to start building an advantage. The first thing you need to do on your turn is figure out which resource you want to try and gain your advantage with. If you have a unit and a link pilot in hand, technically in this state, you can look at pushing to the end of the game, as you would have enough swings to remove all the shields, and then play the link pair to finish off the game. Depending on your opponent's unsuspended units though, this won't be the case, as if they have a blocker, they will be able to turn off one of your swings. If this is the case, or you end up hitting a base outside of their shields, you will have a massive downside of not being able to finish them off that turn. And if you have pushed all of your resources to gain that advantage at the shields, you'll have opened yourself up to having the same thing happen back to you. To avoid this risk, we need to think about how we can gain a resource advantage elsewhere and ensure that we can take full advantage and control of it. The next resource to look at is the field and gaining an advantage there. In the current scenario, you can trade 3 of your units for their suspended units by attacking into them. Focusing on this resource prevents them from being able to wipe out your life on the next turn. You will also have the cards in your hand that will give you more actions to put you ahead after the trade. To push ahead, you need to figure out how to use your resources to force your opponent to either end up still behind at the end of their turn, or they use more resources than you do to end up level. Playing up base can be a very good method of gaining a small advantage, as while it bounces a shield to your hand, it leads to 2 things happening. 1. For a 5 health base to be taken down, it usually takes either 2 units or a piloted unit to do enough damage to take it down. And 2. You don't lose any hand advantage for playing the base. If your opponent commits a unit and a pilot to take down the base, you have forced them to commit an extra resource in the pilot to getting rid of your shields. And if they swing with 2 units to take down the base, then you have effectively gained an extra shield as you went from being 5 swings from death, 4 to remove the shields, and then 1 for a final swing, to 6 swings, 2 for the base, 3 for your remaining shields, and the final swing. You can push this new shield advantage a little bit further by then swinging the final unit you have on field into their shields to take down their own life resources. From this, you have gained a significant shield advantage without losing your even status on the board or in the hand. You can push for even more of an advantage by gaining more control on the board and playing a unit from your hand. The more powerful the unit, the bigger the board advantage this will gain you. After playing a base and a powerful unit, you will most likely be out of resources and be ready to end your turn. Now that you've finished your hypothetical mid-game turn, we need to look at the resource advantage you have gained and lost. When it comes to units and pilots, you now have an advantage. When it comes to shields, you also have an advantage, as while you both have 3 shields in your shield area, on your side of the field, you have a base to protect your shields. When it comes to the hand, you no longer have the advantage as you are down 1 card. However, because you have the advantage in other areas, it's going to force your opponent to use the cards in their hand to catch up to you, which in the end means it will roughly balance out. If on their turn your opponent ends up using more resources, then they will be closer to running out of gas as we mentioned earlier. And if they use an equal amount of resources to put themselves at another level point of the board state, you will then again have the initiative to push for the advantages on your turn. Once all the major push and pulls for advantages have taken place, this is when you will usually enter the late game. The late game can start at any point after the mid game and usually only lasts a few turns. There is no defined time that it is entered, but being able to identify when you can take the initiative and enter the end game will help you close out and win more games. The main thing you need to identify when looking at pushing into the end game is if you can put down the units to end the game and your opponent not have the resources to handle everything you put down. This will be a tough thing to learn as you need to know all the possible cards that can come out and how to deal with them if they do. So don't worry if when you start applying this way of thinking in game it doesn't work out right away. With time you'll get a better intuition. If all things have gone well though and you correctly identified when you can put your units on the board, on your next turn you'll be able to swing away and claim victory. You may hit some bases on the way, and if you do, there is a way to get around it, which is when you start swinging, You need to start with your low AP units, and if you have any units with 5 AP or higher, you save them until last to handle the bases when they come out. And that's basically it. If you're able to manage your resources and find the right time to go wide and swing the game, then you'll find yourself winning more and more games. This isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all approach, as different decks will have slightly different ways they want to operate, but this is a good basis for when you start playing and a way to start thinking critically about the moves you are making. I'm the man in blue. Thanks so much for watching.